This is Daniela Norris on O Books Presents podcast and interview series. We publish great books on the mind-body-spirit connection. And today, my guest is Larry Culliford, speaker, psychiatrist, author, and educator. Hello, Larry. I'm so happy to be able to talk to you today.
Hi, Daniela. This is wonderful.
So tell us a bit about your own spiritual journey, which sounds absolutely fascinating.
Well, that would take a long time to tell you the whole thing. It started, of course, in childhood. I had a wonderful education, particularly in terms of Christian faith. I evolved in my 20s, probably, while I was a medical student, to take an interest in a broader sort of spiritual dimension of life. And in my 30s, took teaching from Tibetan Buddhist monks while I was living in Australia. I learned how to meditate, one of the best things that I ever learned how to do. And I've been writing about spirituality, trying to use a language that is non-denominational, not couched in religious terms, because I think everybody has a spiritual dimension to their lives. And it's my passion, really, to help people better understand themselves and each other. And writing books like Love, Healing, and Happiness is one of the important ways I've managed to find to do that.
So you've written several books, and the one you mentioned, Love, Healing, and Happiness, Spiritual Wisdom for Secular Times, which is a very relevant book in our days where more people are secular and yet they search for something. You've been writing a blog for Psychology Today for the past 7 years, and many more things. Tell us a bit about the themes running through your writing, your books, and your blogs.
Yes, I will. I think one of the major themes is personal development. So I understand that people grow throughout life, very often through adversity, through pain and suffering, the experience of testing times, in a variety of ways, and that this pattern of growth can be understood in terms of stages. In my books, I refer to 6 of those stages, and as you grow, you become, I would say, increasingly spiritually mature, or just simply wiser. I like to talk about wisdom. It's one of the things that I've found in some ways better to talk about now than even spirituality, because wisdom has a kind of a universality to it. It has everybody kind of knows what the word means, even though it's very hard to define it. So wisdom, I suggest, is something that guides us on how to be and how to behave for the best at all times and for all concerned. So growth in wisdom is one of the outcomes of following some kind of spiritual path. Although, of course, people grow in wisdom even though haven't necessarily dedicated their lives to such a path. But I think by couching personal development in these different stages, at different stages, people have different tasks, different, if you like, challenges, and that it must help people if they understand what those challenges are, in order to then find ways to face them and overcome them and grow through them.
And are these stages common to everyone, or are some people born perhaps more spiritually wise than others and start in the middle of one of the stages? How does that work?
That's an excellent question. And I've answered it by suggesting that people develop a kind of split in their minds or in their beings, really, as life goes on, and that in some people that split, which is between their everyday self, their everyday ego, and their soul, or more deeper spiritual self or true self. So the split between the sort of false self that we present to the world and the true self, in some people it never gets very wide. They develop, they go through life on what I refer to as a low trajectory. And then there are other people who have immense troubles, and the split grows very wide. These are people who run into problems with, for instance, addictions or other forms of mental ill health, perhaps, or whose behavior just becomes very destructive, either to themselves or other people, or both. So I would say, in answer to your question, everybody does go through these stages, but some people don't really get very far with them. Some people stay very immature throughout their lives. But if you look at sort of broadly statistically, most people reach the third or fourth stages and kind of get, or between the two, get kind of stuck between the two. And it's only when you get into the fifth and sixth stages that you become much more of a spiritual person. So a lot of my writing in my books and my blog and so on has to do with pointing out the important step that helps a person move from the conformist stage, which is the third stage, where you seek to belong with other people and do what other people do, be guided by the majority, and then the individual stage, stage 4, where you begin to seek to be independent and take responsibility for your own thoughts, words, and actions. There's always a bit of a tension between those two drives, to belong and to be independent. And then the next stage is the integration stage, where the what I described as the everyday ego and the true spiritual self start coming back closer together. That happens usually after a particular sort of awakening moment, or a moment of insight, in which you somehow begin to realize that we are all one, that every human being who has ever been and whoever will be are intimately and seamlessly interconnected, that our lives are utterly intertwined, and that therefore what you do and say, and what you don't do and what you don't say, has a bearing at all times on everybody else. And therefore you are encouraged by those spiritual teachers and guides to be more aware, moment by moment, of the effects you have on other people and on the environment and so on. And once you kind of get that, it matters, what you think and what you say and what you do matters, then and has meaning and gives your life meaning, then you begin to turn towards this further growth, towards integration, and ultimately into the sort of more universal the final stage of complete integration of personality and wholeness of being, really, which is very satisfying.
Yeah, I can really relate to what you're saying with these stages. And what I find particularly interesting is that you're trained as a psychiatrist, but you're obviously not a traditional psychiatrist. And I know from your writing that there was a lot of influence on you from the work of the Trappist monk Thomas Merton. How does that feed into to your traditional, perhaps, psychiatry work?
Well, you're absolutely correct that I'm not, by any stretch, a traditional psychiatrist. About 20 years ago now, in the late 90s, a group of several, maybe half a dozen or more psychiatrists found ourselves, we kept meeting in various different conferences and other situations that were you could say, broadly speaking, of a spiritual nature. I think most of us were members of the scientific and medical network. And we, led by psychiatrist Andrew Powell, we formed within the Royal College of Psychiatrists a special interest group called the Psychiatry and Spirituality Special Interest Group, which started with small ambitions but has grown. I believe there are something like 4,000 psychiatrist members now. We were asked to write publications for journals about spirituality and psychiatry, and we held meetings, and those meetings continue to be held by the special interest group. I was, on the committee. I helped to write many of the papers, and indeed there's a leaflet which the Royal College still makes available for free and through its website as well, for on the subject of spirituality and mental health, which I helped to write. And so we do think of it as important, and I think increasingly people within the profession do at least acknowledge that the spiritual dimension is relevant to inquire into. I wrote a paper on assessing a person's spiritual needs, or taking a spiritual history, for instance. So it's there, it's available, but it isn't part of the curriculum. You don't get examined on spirituality and mental health. And therefore it's not really mainstream. And I suspect that's because it's not part of the culture. It's not part of our society that people should routinely pay attention to their spiritual lives. It's still, as you say, a secular, materialist, consumerist culture that we all inhabit, with its set of values, which are about wealth, about fame, about possessions, about power over other people. And these are not themselves negative values, but they are destructive when they dominate over spiritual values, what I call spiritual values, or wisdom based values like kindness and patience, humility, honesty, particularly honesty. And so then you'll see from my discussion that we're going outside psychiatry now. We're into social commentary and thinking about mental health. And I think that's important, is to think about mental health, not to just think about mental illness and how to fix it, but to think about mental health and how to grow towards mental and social health and spiritual health. That's an important direction that I don't think a lot of people are yet beginning to think about as necessary. But those who are thinking about it as necessary, I think, get convinced very quickly about the way that things appear to be going in the world, and how helpful it might be if more people took up the idea that there was such a thing as mental, social, and spiritual health to work towards.
Absolutely. And I think, people like you who come from a more medical background, to have more scientific background, who do bridge this gap between our lives today, current affairs. I'm looking at some of your blog titles here at Psychology Today: A Spiritual Approach to Politics, and A Solution to All of the World's Major Problems, and Forgiveness, Neighbors Can Be Tricky, Living a Meaningful Life. I think these kind of works are really helpful in taking us from what we see every day in the everyday world today, politics and whatnot, to the next step. I'm really curious about Thomas Merton and his influence on your journey.
Yes. I didn't answer that part of your question. Well, when I was training in psychiatry in Australia, I arranged a workshop to be run by a Jungian therapist, and it was so successful that we asked him to come again. And the second time he came, a year later, he brought with him a Tibetan monk, a Tibetan Buddhist monk, actually an American who had gone to study with the Dalai Lama and become a monk. And this was the person who introduced me not only to meditation, but to some basic ideas of Buddhism. Sometime later, when I was back in the UK, the Dalai Lama himself came to address a 3-day conference run by the World Community for Christian Meditation. This was in 1996 at Middlesex University campus. And he spoke about Thomas Merton, who he had met and spent 3 days in conversation with in 1968, very soon before Merton died. Sadly, he was electrocuted accidentally in an accident with an electrical appliance while he was still away from America in Thailand. So the Dalai Lama mentioned Thomas Merton to me. So I started to read up Merton, who was taking a very strong he never in any sense betrayed his deeply religious and Christian faith, but he took a great interest in other world faiths, Buddhism, Hinduism, particularly the Sufi branch of Islam, and Judaism, and so on. And he somehow made sense of them all. You know, he made them all sound as if they were kind of sort of sharing the same wisdom, really. And I still read from Thomas Merton. I mean, he wrote 60 books, and I'm still finding new ones to read and enjoying them all the time. And you know, there is a Thomas Merton Society of Great Britain and Ireland, of which I used to be chair. There is an International Thomas Merton Society. I'm going in June this year to their big conference in California. I'm going to do a workshop there. And so not only his writing, but the other people that Thomas Merton has inspired, I've met so many of them, and they have enriched my life. It's been a very fruitful kind of engagement with this man and his life and his work. And my wife actually Sarah this morning just said Thomas Merton's like a kind of mentor for you, and that's true. He has been, although of course I never met him.
That's fascinating. And you mentioned that your book Love, Healing and Happiness somehow led to your marriage to Sarah.
Oh yes. Well, you know, it is wonderful, isn't it? You write books, they get published and sold, and you kind of don't always know what the outcomes are. But one very special and positive outcome was that I met Sarah in the year 2007, the same year that Love, Healing and Happiness was published. And we met. She was a psychiatric nurse interested in spirituality, and we met at a psychiatric conference where each of us was, as it happens, presenting something related to spirituality and mental health. And so we began a conversation, and our friendship began that way, was really quite professional, and we would email and speak on the telephone. But when we finally got to meet, I was able to give Sarah a copy of Love, Healing and Happiness, which had just been published. And it happened that she was about to go away on a week's holiday. So she took the book, and she read it. And when she came back, and the first time we met after she came back, I could tell that there was a kind of difference, a shift in her attitude. She was very much more positive, you know, in her, feelings of obviously attraction towards me than before. And she said, you know, it was reading the book that made her realize what kind of a person I was. I had sort of hidden depths that she hadn't spotted before, and you know, she and I obviously began to have more of a romantic relationship than a professional one that we had before.
So this book that you've written in 2000, you've published in 2007, is actually one of many. I understand you also write under different pen name?
Well, before that, I wrote 3 books for a Rider books on the subject of happiness under the pen name Patrick Whiteside. This was 2 small books: The Little Book of Happiness and The Little Book of Bliss, and then Happiness, the 30-Day Guide. These were, very successful. And indeed, The Little Book of Happiness and Happiness, the 30-Day Guide, those are both still going strong. And The Little Book of Happiness was recently, about a year ago, republished in a hardback format and still selling very nicely. But then I wrote Love, Healing and Happiness, or an earlier draft, and that publisher wasn't so keen. So out of the blue one day, I was contacted by John Hunt of O Books publisher, and he said, would I like to think about writing something for him and for his company? And of course, I had one almost ready to hand. So that's how it came to be published by O Books and John Hunt Publishing. Love, Healing and Happiness. It was already there, just ready to go almost.
It was meant to be.
Sorry?
It was meant to be.
It was meant to be, yes, I think so. Well, I live my life by that. I write in a secular terminology most of the time, but I am a religious person, a church-going Christian, and I do believe in God who works through the Holy Spirit, and that the Holy Spirit makes things happen. I hardly ever believe in coincidence. I think things are, as you say, meant to be. And I think a lot of people, have the same intuitive understanding that there is some benign, divine force at work that helps us if we seek it out, seek it to help us. Certainly, I do. All my writing feels like I'm inspired. I mean, so often I'll wake in the night sometimes and just turn to my notebook and write down the next sentence or paragraph or page or almost chapter of the next book I'm writing. Once I woke up and had the whole book in my head, just clear as that, and wrote down all the chapter headings straight away. And then this was my most recent book called Seeking Wisdom, a Spiritual Manifesto. I'd been to a religious place, the community of Iona, that day, and that night, woke in the night with this inspiration for this entire book, which I then when I came home from Scotland, excuse me, I wrote it very quickly in just 2 or 3 months, and that's now been published by the Buckingham University Press, Seeking Wisdom.
That is what I call inspired writing. And how can readers connect with you if they want to learn more? Obviously, they can seek your books at their bookshops or order them online. How else can they connect with you? You have a website?
Yes, I have a website. Yes. Actually, I once had a website called happinessite.com, and I believe that still operates, and it brings you to my current website, which is LDC, those are my initials, ldc52.co.uk. And people can go there, and from there they can get my email details. And I have to say I'm very blessed by getting frequent email contact from all over the world, people who've read things or found out about me. They want to make comments or ask questions, and I'm only too happy to respond in as helpfully as I can. Because it really is my joy to try and help people understand themselves and each other.
And you run also another website that is it www? Do you want to say that, and we'll write it later at the end of the interview?
It's www.ow.net, and the W's, etc., all stand for the World Wide Wave of Wisdom.
That Absolutely wonderful, Larry. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I have so many more questions, but I think I will have to go and read the rest of your books and maybe start reading a bit from Thomas Merton himself. Very inspiring.
Okay. Well, just recently, 2 or 3 people have written to say, I want to read about Merton. What shall I read? So I have some recommendations. If you get in touch with me later, I'll let you have them.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Larry, and all the best. And I hope to read more from you. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much, Daniela. Me too. God bless you.
This is Daniela Norris with O Book Presents, podcast and interview series. O Book publishes great mind, body, spirit books. My guest today was Larry Culliford, psychiatrist and author of Love, Healing and Happiness, Spiritual Wisdom for Secular Times, as well as several other books. You can find these books at your favorite bookshop or order them online. And connect with Larry through his website www.ldc52.co.uk and also www.ow.net. Thank you so much for listening.